Good evening, Peter. How are you this evening?
Very good.
Excellent. Tell us about your book, But Didn't We Have Fun?
Well, my book is really an attempt to recreate my favorite era of baseball, the era between the 1840s and the 1870s. And what I wanted to do, my first book was on baseball in Michigan in that period, but it was a very detailed book, and I realized I was very proud of it, but it also wasn't the easiest book to read. So what I wanted to do was sort of try to tell the same story, but really let the players tell the story for them. So, at first that seemed like a hard thing to do, but as I started to work on the book, I found all these reminiscences that had been left behind. And I thought, well, if I could just let the players speak for themselves, that would be a great book. And so in the end, that's really what I tried to do, was step out of the way, explain. Sometimes I had to explain what they were talking about, especially for a modern audience and even for somebody who's not familiar, even for vintage players who are familiar with the game, but maybe not some of the language. Sometimes I have to explain things, but by and large, the best part of the book is when I'm able to get out of the way and let the players talk about why they love baseball in that era so much.
I've read your book on Michigan and thoroughly enjoyed it, but I am finding that But Didn't We Have Fun is easier to read. I think you've really put it into layman's terms.
That was my goal, and when I was writing the Michigan book, boy, there's so much great detail that I wanted to get it all in, but it does make it for a somewhat difficult read, and this book is probably about half the length, and yet I'm covering the whole country, and really what I left out was a lot of the dates and names and places and scores that don't really matter anymore, and what I tried to get in was what mattered, which was why the players enjoyed themselves so much, the sense of camaraderie that they had, the sense of being part of a club and what that meant to them, the spirit in which they played the game, the way in which they played the game, and their enthusiasm for it.
Now, something that I found in the book is that there's a lot of research in there that I've never seen before or even referenced to. Where are you finding all this stuff?
I'm a real research nut. I love finding sources that are buried various places. I went through the whole Chadwick scrapbooks, which are a wonderful resource. I went through the Harry Wright scrapbooks. There's a lot of stuff coming out on the internet now where various archives are now available of old newspapers, and you can search the early newspapers, or you can also search somewhat. What I find it's interesting to search newspapers between 1840 and 1870 for accounts of that period. But what I found really fascinating was to search a little later and to try to find earlier players reminiscing about those. And it's hard to find, but when you find an account, boy, those are the things that you just really cherish.
Now, for a club that's researching their original roots and things like that, can you give them any advice as to how to find that information and where they should start looking first?
I would start at the local public library. Often local public libraries have a wonderful resource, and it varies widely from place to place. But a lot of times they'll have a card catalog, they'll have a local history room that will have really good details. I think my book is a good place to look and see. It's obviously it's all over the place. So some places get a lot more attention than others. But I tried to put in the places that are in there. Marshall Wright's book is very good to get a sense of what teams are playing in that era. But his is more focused on he has a book called the National Association 1850 to 1870. Mm-hmm. But his is a little more focused on the East Coast. So for East Coast players, there's a lot of stuff there. But for the Midwest, it sort of depends whether somebody's gone and done the primary research or not. But a lot more of it's being done. When I did the Michigan book, I really had no idea how much baseball was being played before 1870. And now, not only I'm digging on that, but other people are starting to dig a lot more on that.
Now, with your books in mind and the research that you've done for But Didn't We Have Fun or Game of Inches, your Michigan book, what do you see? What are some things that you think vintage baseball clubs should be doing that they aren't?
I would just the biggest thing I would like to see vintage teams do is really explain the rules and the strategies. Is have somebody there, have somebody on hand who's able to explain it. And I think that to me that's what makes it really interesting to a fan, because to somebody who stops by and is watching. Because I think the game is really interesting for one inning if you're just sitting there, but then you start to go, well, why are they doing things? And that becomes hard to understand. So I think having a good interpreter, a good person who's able to explain what the rules and strategies are and why they're doing certain things, I think that's really really important. The other thing I'd love to do is see vintage baseball teams play on fields that more resemble the fields that they played back then, which is not the really flat surfaces that we play on today and that most vintage games are played on, but with hillocks and impediments and even trees in the way. Because that's how a lot of games were played back then. Obviously, they tried to get really nice level surfaces, but that was a hard thing to do. And so a lot of games were played on fields that were anything but ideal, especially the outfield. They try to get a nice infield, but the outfields would often have trees in them, rabbit holes, you name it. Just incredibly big hills that the outfielders would run up and down.
Now, are there any fields that you can think of today that would resemble that clubs are playing on?
I don't know that any clubs are playing on that. I mean, they're certainly around, but nobody thinks of playing baseball on them because literally there were often just huge impediments that would get in the way of the game. Mm-hmm. I found one account that I got really amused at. Now we think in today's baseball you put the fastest runner in center field and the best thrower in right field, but in the 1860s, they would put the outfielder who was the best at running up and down hills in whichever outfield had the biggest hill, because it's that difficult of a thing to do to run after a fly ball while also keeping your eye on the ground and not tripping and falling down as you run up or down a hill.
Now, how prevalent was the fair foul used in the early part of the game?
It had a pretty brief vogue. It really doesn't come in until the end of the 1860s, because it's so easy. Until the end of the 1860s, there's really a lot of places to hit the ball anyways, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to aim to hit a deliberate fair foul when it's pretty easy. It really comes in around 1868, 69. You start to hear about it when a few teams are going to the dead balls, and then when a bunch of teams go to the dead balls in 1870, it becomes a big part of the strategy for 5 years. And the few players who can use it are able to be very effective with it. But it's basically a function of the fact that when they go to the dead ball, all of a sudden hits become rare, and this becomes an effective way to get a hit. But until they go to the dead balls, hits are easy enough to get that there's no real reason to try to deliberately to use this extra tactic.
Wow. Now, what do you think were the contributors to the very high scores of the early days?
Rubbery, lively balls and bad fields. The bad fields is really it's hard to overstate how difficult it is to field. Every ground ball even was an adventure, and fly balls in particular. The outfielders running after a fly ball when you're running up and down a hill, or there's an obstacle in the way. There might even be a tree or a bush or something to do is an incredibly difficult thing. So just the difficulty of fielding the ball and the ease of hitting it, and of course the difficulty to the pitcher of making a really difficult delivery.
Okay. Now, looking at the original question, kind of a vice versa, what do you see some clubs doing that they shouldn't be doing?
Well, certainly tally bells are not an authentic thing. The term crank is a later term. The term I think some teams for pitchers I know use hurler, which is just completely inaccurate. That's a 20th century term, and of course the pitcher didn't hurl the ball. He pitched it, and that was the whole point. And when pitchers started to go towards overhand, they'd start to say, "Well, he's not a pitcher anymore; he's a thrower." But that was the term, and I don't know where somebody got the term hurler from. So that's one of my pet peeves.
Well, as long as we've talked on one of the positions, can you take us on a trip around the field and call the positions as you would? correctly?
Well, the pitcher was a pitcher. The catcher is starting to be called more the catcher than anything else. Sometimes he's referred to as being behind, but behind isn't usually a noun. It's usually more of an adverb. So catcher is the most common term. And then the other positions really have their the same names as today: first baseman, second baseman, third baseman, shortstop, and some of the outfield. They'd sometimes just talk of the field or the fielders, but it was also called the outfield. And
I've heard the term scout used, or gardener.
Scout is a New England term, as far as I recall. I've certainly seen that in the New England game, but it was sort of used because players were all over the place. I don't remember seeing gardener in this era at all.
Okay.
Might have been used occasionally, but it certainly wasn't common.
If you were to have the ideal umpire, what would the duties of the umpire? What do you see them doing during that period?
Until which specific years are you asking?
Well, look, I'm looking 1850s, 1860s, even into the 1870s.
Okay, well, it changes rapidly. I mean, in the 1850s, he can literally be sitting in a chair with an umbrella over his head and making very few calls with a rule book there, but not really doing much, and really just being a dignitary, being a figure who looks after the game and tells a player, occasionally reminds a player not to use inappropriate language since there are ladies here, and occasionally makes a ruling. But basically, the umpire didn't make rulings in the 1850s. By the 1860s, you have called balls. In 1858, I think 1863, you have called strikes, and the players on tag plays at the bases are starting to ask for judgment all the time. So the umpire is starting to make a lot of rulings by the 1860s. And by the 1870s, he's becoming much closer to today. He's being asked to make a call on every play, and instead of being treated with great courtesy as he had been in the 1860s, there's starting to be a lot of disputing of his calls, and it's becoming a very difficult position to play.
Now, as an umpire, where would you see him on the field?
In the 1850s, he's about 15 or 20 feet behind the plate and off to the side, so he's a safe distance where he's not going to get in the way, where he can see the action, but he's not going to get hit by the ball. That's really the primary concern. As I say, often seated in a chair with an umbrella over his head, and everybody's looking after him. As he's starting to make more calls, he starts to get a little closer to home base, but he's still well behind the home base, because the catchers are usually still well behind home base, and he's off to the side. So the idea is to keep him outside of the range where he's likely to be hit by a ball. Okay. And he pretty much stays there. In the 1880s, there are a few experiments with umpires standing behind the pitcher, but only a few umpires tried that, and most of them concluded, because there was still only one umpire then, so most umpires concluded that they couldn't call balls and strikes effectively enough. That gave them a much better angle of covering on plays at first and second base, but it really hurt them on plays at the plate. And I've been doing a lot of research. One of my favorite men of the 19th century was an umpire named Billy Stage, who umpired in the National League in 1894. And what was fascinating about Billy Stage was he was a world record holder in the 100-yard dash at the time, and also the world record holder in the 220-yard dash. So he would stand behind home plate, and as soon as the ball was hit, he would run down to first base, and he'd be standing and waiting at first base when the batter got to first base.
Wow.
And if the player was at second base, he would run down there too. And Jennings said if there was a close play and he would slide into place, Billy Stage would slide in there too ahead of him and be right there to make the call. And then he'd stand up and dust himself off and so on. So it became an incredibly demanding position for the umpire. And I would have if I could have watched one game in baseball history, it'd be a game umpired by Billy Stage when he was the world record holder in the 100-yard dash, running around the field and getting to every base before the play could occur there.
Fantastic. Now, In your book, Didn't We Have Fun? You talk about the Knickerbockers and their 6-cent fine that was documented, I think you said once. How prevalent were fines during this period?
I think they were fairly prevalent. I mean, they were a rule. They were, the clubs were. It was important to the clubs to keep their rules. On the other hand, they were having fun, and sometimes they got themselves a little carried away, and they would come late, or they would swear when they think, oh, I shouldn't have said that word, or they would get just a little carried away, and so on. And so a lot of the fines, I think, were just small things to enforce the rules, and they were ways to pay the club's various expenses too. So I think fines were a fairly common part, and they were something that they were not a thing that people would get all upset about. They would just say, oh yeah, that's a rule. Of course, I broke the rule and I forgot, and I'll pay the fine.
Now, you talk about the 6-cent fine in your book. Was that about the average, or how high did they go?
I think the fines were meant to be small amounts. Obviously 6 cents was a lot more then than it is now, but it was sort of meant to be almost a way of collecting dues, and it certainly wasn't a way to make somebody feel terrible and like they'd done a terrible act. It was just a way to enforce the rules, and really also, just almost a way of collecting the dues that needed to be paid anyways by issuing fines. And if somebody was really, in that way, if somebody was really kept misbehaving, then they would pay a little more dues than the other people. But I think it was something that the more that they laughed at and enjoyed than that was something that was a contentious issue.
Now, do you play on a club?
No, I don't. There hasn't been one in Lansing since I've been here. But maybe one of these days.
Fantastic. Any new books in the works? Any new projects?
Yeah, I'm working on a book on the early catcher right now. I've become really fascinated with the catcher's position. In the years before they wear any equipment, as some of them are starting to creep close to home plate, but are enduring tremendous abuse to their bodies from doing so, but being incredibly important to the team if they're successfully able to play close to there. And what I'm doing is I'm putting them in the tradition of other American heroes. I'm arguing that really it was a time when a lot of the American heroes were kind of dying out because Americans were moving to the cities, and they'd always looked up to heroes like cowboys, frontiersmen, gun slingers, and various Western heroes. And as America became a very urban country, and people were moving into the cities, none of these old modes of the heroism applied. And so I'm arguing that the catcher became the hero figure. And what helps me out in that was that Stephen Crane spent most of his time trying to be a catcher for the Syracuse University baseball team in the years immediately before he wrote the book, The Red Badge of Courage. And so I'm kind of arguing that when he wrote that book, he was really drawing on his own experience in feeling that for the generation that grew up in the years after the Civil War, there weren't any other the traditional paths to becoming a hero and even just becoming a man were slipping away from young men of that generation. And so they looked to baseball, and specifically the catcher's position, as a kind of a new model of heroism and courage. Wow.
I'm looking forward to that book. That sounds very interesting.
Oh, thanks.
Now, are there any places that you're going to be doing book signings that players can come out, get your book, and get a copy?
Usually around mid-Michigan. I'm hoping to make it out to Henry Ford Dearborn this summer, but we haven't set a date yet for that. So I'm sure I'll be doing some in mid-Michigan this winter, or this summer, and maybe around, but not a lot set up right now.
And where can we get more information about your books and your research?
I have a website, www.petermorrisbooks.com.
And I'll be sure to get that on our companion site. I want to thank you very much for the interview, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Oh, great. Glad to be here.